A billionaire forced his ex-wife to work for him, but she was hiding a life-changing secret. Claire tightened her coat around her as the cold wind whipped through the empty street. The city lights flickered above, casting a soft glow on the worn pavement as she hurried down the sidewalk, her tired feet aching with every step. Lucas's small hand was wrapped around hers, his tiny fingers warm against her skin. He skipped beside her, oblivious to the worries weighing her down. "Mommy, can we have pancake for dinner?" Lucas asked, his bright blue eyes, so much like his father's, sparkling with excitement. Claire forced a smile, hiding the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. "Of course, sweetheart," she said softly. "Pancakes sound perfect." Lucas grinned, satisfied with her answer, and began humming a tune as they walked the last few steps to their tiny apartment. Claire fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. The moment they stepped inside, the weight of the day crashed down on her. She set down her worn-out handbag and knelt beside Lucas, cupping his soft cheeks in her hands. "Go wash your hands, baby. I'll start dinner." Lucas nodded and scurried off, his little feet pattering against the floor. Claire sighed and leaned against the kitchen counter, closing her eyes for a moment. She had barely enough money left to make it through the week. Rent was overdue, and Lucas's last doctor's visit had drained what little savings she had left. She had once dreamed of a life filled with love, security, and happiness. She had believed in a future with Ethan, a future that had shattered into pieces 5 years ago. He had walked away without a second glance, leaving her to pick up the broken remains of their marriage. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat, pushing the memories aside. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past, not when her son needed her. After dinner, Claire tucked Lucas into bed, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. She lingered by his side, brushing back his curls as he drifted off to sleep. His peaceful expression was the only thing that kept her going. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping her out of her thoughts. A message from her friend and former colleague, Olivia, flashed on the screen. "Olivia, Claire, I have a job lead for you. It's at Blackwood Enterprises. Pay is excellent. You should apply." Claire's breath hitched. Blackwood Enterprises. Ethan's company. Her fingers trembled as she typed a response. "Claire, Liv, I can't. You know who owns that company." "Olivia." "I know, but Claire, you need this. It's a stable job, and the salary is enough to cover Lucas's medical bills. You won't even have to deal with him directly. Just think about it, okay?" Claire stared at the message for a long moment. The thought of stepping back into Ethan's world sent a chill down her spine. But Olivia was right. Lucas needed her to be strong, and she had run out of options. The next morning, Claire found herself standing in front of the towering glass building of Blackwood Enterprises. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the sounds of the bustling city around her. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, gripping the strap of her handbag. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The lobby was grand, sleek marble floors reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers above. Employees in sharp business attire moved swiftly, their conversations blending into a hum of corporate efficiency. Claire kept her head down as she approached the reception desk. "Claire Lawson," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I have an interview scheduled for the executive assistant position." The receptionist smiled politely and directed her to the 25th floor. Claire stepped into the elevator, her fingers clenching around the folder containing her resume. The doors opened to a pristine office space, the air thick with the scent of coffee and expensive cologne. A woman in a navy blue suit greeted her. "Ms. Lawson? Right this way." Claire followed, her heart hammering as they entered a glass-walled conference room. The interview went smoothly, too smoothly. Her experience and skills impressed the hiring manager, and within an hour, she was offered the job. As she walked out of the office, an unsettling feeling crept over her. Was fate playing some cruel joke? Or was this an opportunity disguised as a nightmare? She didn't have time to dwell on it. She needed this job. For Lucas. But deep down, Claire knew, walking into Blackwood Enterprises was like stepping into the lion's den. And the lion had no idea she was back. Ethan Blackwood stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, his sharp gaze fixed on the city skyline. Power and control were his domain, and emotions had no place in his world. 5 years. 5 years since he had last seen Claire. Since he had walked away, convinced that she had betrayed him. He had buried the past, drowning himself in work and success. He had convinced himself that she no longer mattered. But when his assistant placed a file on his desk, his entire world tilted. "Sir, your new executive assistant's records," the assistant said before walking out. Ethan barely glanced at the file, until a familiar name caught his eye. Claire Lawson. His body went rigid. His grip tightened around the folder as he flipped it open. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier with each passing second. There she was, the woman who had once been his wife. The woman who had destroyed everything. Anger surged through him, swift and burning. His jaw clenched as he scanned through the details. Why was she here? Did she plan this? Was this her way of crawling back into his life? A bitter laugh escaped his lips. If she thought he would welcome her back, she was mistaken. Ethan pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Get Claire Lawson in my office. Now." His voice was ice. This time, he wouldn't let her walk away unscathed. Claire wiped her hands on a napkin and took a deep breath. She had just finished sorting through an overwhelming stack of paperwork, documents that Ethan had conveniently dumped on her desk right before she was supposed to leave for the night. It wasn't the first time. Since she had started working at Blackwood Enterprises, he had made it his mission to push her to her limits, assigning her the most grueling, mind-numbing tasks imaginable. Reports that weren't even part of her job description, last-minute presentations that required hours of research, and meetings scheduled without warning. If he thought she would break, he was wrong. She refused to let Ethan see her struggle, even when exhaustion gnawed at her, even when her fingers ached from typing late into the night. She met every challenge with quiet determination. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fail. Tonight was no different. It was nearly 10, and most of the office had cleared out, but she was still here, sorting through spreadsheets Ethan had demanded to be reviewed by morning. She could feel his gaze on her from across the room, watching like a hawk, waiting for her to falter. When she finally finished, Claire gathered her things, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the elevator without sparing him a glance. Not even a thank you for the extra work. Ethan's voice was smooth, edged with something she couldn't quite name. She turned, meeting his gaze head-on. "Thank you," she repeated, arching an eyebrow. "For what? Making my job unnecessarily difficult." His lips curled into a smirk, but his eyes remained unreadable. "I thought you liked a challenge." Claire forced a smile. "I do. That's why I haven't quit." Something flickered in his expression, something almost like admiration, but it was gone before she could decipher it. He leaned back against his desk, watching her with that calculating gaze she had come to despise. "You always were stubborn," he mused. "That hasn't changed." Claire swallowed hard, the words hitting deeper than they should have. She didn't want to talk about the past. She didn't want to remember the way they used to challenge each other, push each other, how their battles had once been laced with laughter instead of venom. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. The following days passed in a blur of tension. Every time Claire walked into the office, she felt the weight of Ethan's gaze. Their interactions were laced with unspoken resentment, with sharp remarks exchanged in passing. And yet, beneath it all, something else simmered, something unspoken, something dangerous. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his hand would clench into a fist whenever another man so much as spoke to her, the way his voice softened, barely, but enough, when he said her name. And then there were the memories. They came without warning. A whispered laugh in the middle of the night, the way his hands had once traced patterns on her skin, the way he had looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. But those days were long gone. Ethan didn't love her anymore, and even if he did, it wouldn't change a thing. Claire sat at her desk, fingers hovering over her keyboard. Her phone vibrated beside her, and she quickly glanced around before picking it up. Lucas's daycare. Her stomach clenched. She answered immediately. "Hello, Ms. Lawson," This is Miss Parker from Little Steps Daycare. Lucas has a fever, and he's been crying for the past hour. We've tried giving him some water, but he keeps asking for you." Claire shot up from her chair, her heart pounding. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. She grabbed her coat, barely registering the sound of her chair scraping against the floor as she pushed it back. "Where do you think you're going?" Ethan's voice froze her in place. She turned slowly, already bracing for the fight she knew was coming. "I need to leave," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Ethan leaned back in his chair, regarding her with cool disinterest. "We have a meeting in 10 minutes. I can't be here." His expression darkened. "You storm into my company after 5 years, beg for a job, and now you think you can come and go as you please?" Claire gritted her teeth. "I don't have time for this." She turned to leave, but his voice lashed out like a whip. "You're just as irresponsible as ever." She stopped dead in her tracks, fury flooding through her veins. Slowly, she turned back, her eyes blazing. "You don't know anything about me anymore, Ethan." His gaze locked onto hers, cold and unforgiving. "Then prove me wrong." She didn't have time to argue. Every second spent here was a second Lucas needed her. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out. Ethan watched her go, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Something wasn't right. Claire had always been strong-willed, but this was different. She had looked desperate, panicked, and Ethan Blackwood hated not knowing why. Claire burst through the daycare doors, her heart racing. Lucas lay curled up on a small cot, his tiny face flushed with fever. His bottom lip wobbled when he saw her, but the moment she knelt beside him, he threw his arms around her neck. "Mommy," he whimpered. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she held them back. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." She pressed a kiss to his forehead, feeling the heat of his fever against her lips. Miss Parker approached with a worried expression. His fever spiked quickly. "I think you should take him to a doctor." Claire nodded, scooping Lucas into her arms. "Thank you." She carried him outside, her mind already racing through the next steps. She needed to get him home, check his temperature, call the doctor if it got worse. She was so focused on Lucas that she didn't notice the sleek black car parked across the street. Ethan sat inside, his grip tight around the steering wheel as he watched Claire cradle the child in her arms. A child with dark hair. A child with familiar, striking blue eyes. His blue eyes. His heart slammed against his ribs. Everything inside him went still. Claire had a son, and Ethan Blackwood had just discovered the one secret she had been fighting to keep. Claire pressed a cool washcloth to Lucas's forehead, whispering soft reassurances as he stirred in his sleep. His little body was warm against her, his breath uneven as he whimpered in discomfort. The doctor had assured her it was just a viral fever. Nothing serious, but that did little to ease the tight knot in her chest. She brushed his damp curls away from his forehead, her fingers trembling slightly. She had been so close to getting caught. The moment she stepped out of the daycare and saw Ethan's car across the street, she felt her heart stop. She didn't know if he had seen them, if he had noticed the striking resemblance between Lucas and himself, but she didn't wait to find out. She had rushed home, locking the doors behind her, shutting the blinds as though that could keep the truth from reaching him. But she knew better. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to let something go once he had a reason to be suspicious. Her phone buzzed, and her stomach twisted when she saw his name flashing across the screen. Ethan. Her fingers hovered over the answer button, but she hesitated. If she picked up, what would she say? What if he already knew? What if this was the moment everything came crashing down? The ringing stopped. A breath shuddered from her lips. She tried to steady herself, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then the phone buzzed again. A text this time. "Ethan, you left work in a hurry." "I assume it was urgent?" She swallowed, her heart pounding. "Claire, yes. It was personal." A few seconds passed before the next message came through. "Ethan, and yet, you refused to tell me what was so important that you abandoned your job." She clenched her jaw. He was testing her, digging. "Claire, I don't owe you an explanation." Another pause, and then, "Ethan, I think you do." She could feel the walls closing in. She had spent years keeping Lucas hidden from him, building a life where Ethan Blackwood's presence could never touch them. But now, for the first time in 4 years, she felt the fragile foundation of her world begin to crack. Because she knew Ethan, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he found the truth. The next morning, Claire walked into the office, feeling the weight of the previous night pressing down on her. She had barely slept. Between checking Lucas's temperature every hour and the gnawing fear that Ethan was piecing things together, she was running on pure exhaustion. And now she had to face him. She stepped out of the elevator, took a deep breath, and made her way toward her desk. But before she could sit, a voice sliced through the air. "Claire, my office. Now." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. She turned slowly, meeting Ethan's stormy gaze from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something she couldn't quite decipher. With a silent prayer, she followed him inside. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing them in. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. Claire stood stiffly, forcing herself to meet his stare head-on. "You left work without permission," he finally said, his voice deceptively calm. She inhaled slowly. "I told you it was personal." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving." Ethan's jaw tensed. His patience was razor-thin. She could feel it in the air between them. "Tell me, Claire," he said, voice dipping into something dangerously low. "Are you hiding something from me?" Her stomach twisted. Did he know? Was this it? Her fingers dug into the fabric of her dress, nails pressing against her palms. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. Ethan pushed off the desk, closing the distance between them in slow, deliberate steps. "You're lying." Her pulse spiked. "I have no reason to." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Don't you?" She forced herself to hold his gaze. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Ethan?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. Her breath caught when she saw the screen, an image of her outside the daycare, holding Lucas in her arms. Her world tilted. Everything inside her went still. Ethan took a step closer. Who is he? Claire's throat went dry. Her mind screamed for her to lie, to say it was nothing, to find a way out of this, but she knew it wouldn't work. Not this time. Ethan wasn't guessing anymore. He knew. Her silence only seemed to confirm it. His fingers tightened around the phone, his breathing sharp and uneven. "How long were you planning to keep this from me?" His voice was low, raw. Claire's chest ached. Her worst fear had finally come true. She took a slow, shaky breath. "Ethan, But before she could say another word, he turned away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You had my son," he said, almost to himself, as if he was still trying to grasp the reality of it. Claire's lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. "I had a son this whole time, and you never told me," Ethan continued, his voice laced with something she had never heard before. Betrayal. Pain. Claire took a step forward. "I did what I had to do." He turned on her so fast that she flinched. "You kept him from me." She held her ground, her own anger rising to meet his. "You walked away, Ethan. You left me. You hated me." His eyes flashed. "I would have never walked away if I had known." She let out a bitter laugh. "Would you? Or would you have tried to destroy me the way you're doing now?" The words hung between them, sharp and unforgiving. For the first time since she stepped into this office, Ethan didn't have a response, because deep down they both knew the answer. This was just the beginning of the storm. Ethan paced in his office, his hands clenched into fists as frustration simmered beneath his skin. Claire was hiding something. He could feel it in his bones. Every time he pushed for answers, she shut him out. Every time he got too close, she slipped away. It was infuriating, maddening, and he couldn't let it go. He had spent the past few days watching her, studying her every move. She was careful, too careful. She never spoke about her personal life, never mentioned anyone outside of work. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where her mask slipped. A nervous glance at her phone, a sudden urgency to leave, the quiet sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Something was there, and Ethan was going to find out what it was. Without hesitation, He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Mr. Blackwood. A voice answered on the other end. What can I do for you? I need you to look into someone for me, Ethan said, his voice sharp with determination. Claire Lawson. Dig into her past. Find out where she's been, who she's been with. I want everything. There was a brief pause. Understood. I'll start immediately. Ethan hung up, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something heavier. He needed answers, and he wouldn't stop until he had them. The next evening, Ethan found himself at the company's annual gala, a night meant for business deals, networking, and high society charm. He had attended these events 100 times before, but tonight his focus was elsewhere. Because Claire was here, and she looked breathtaking. She wore a deep emerald gown that hugged her curves, her dark hair cascading in soft waves over her shoulders. She moved through the crowd with quiet grace, avoiding unnecessary attention. But Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. His jaw tightened. She looked like the woman he once loved, the woman who had shattered his heart. And despite everything, he hated how she still had this hold on him. Determined to keep his emotions in check, he approached her. Enjoying yourself? Claire tensed at the sound of his voice. She turned to face him, her expression carefully guarded. I didn't realize you cared. Ethan smirked, though there was no humor in his eyes. I don't, but I do care about my employees doing their jobs. And so far, all I see you doing is avoiding me. She arched a brow. Maybe that should tell you something. His eyes darkened. Maybe it does. The tension between them was thick, electric. Neither looked away. Neither backed down. Before he could say another word, someone approached them, congratulating Ethan on the success of the company. Claire took the opportunity to slip away, but Ethan followed, his patience hanging by a thread. He caught up with her in a quiet hallway, away from the crowd. Running away again? He asked, his voice low. Claire turned, fire in her eyes. What do you want from me, Ethan? His jaw tightened. I want the truth. She scoffed. The truth? You wouldn't believe it even if I told you. Try me. For a moment, silence stretched between them. And then, you left me, she whispered, her voice laced with pain. You walked away and never looked back. And now you expect me to stand here and act like none of it ever happened. Ethan's heart pounded. I walked away because I thought you betrayed me. Claire's eyes glistened, her lips trembling. You never gave me a chance to explain. His chest ached at the raw emotion in her voice, but before he could respond, Claire took a step back. This conversation is over. She turned to leave, but Ethan caught her wrist. Don't, she whispered, shaking her head. Don't do this. But he did, because in that moment, every ounce of anger, every unsaid word, every buried feeling exploded all at once. And before he knew it, his lips were on hers. The kiss was desperate, filled with years of pain, longing, and something neither of them wanted to name. For a second, Claire melted into him. But then, she pulled away, breathless. This was a mistake, she whispered. Ethan stared at her, his heart racing. Before he could stop her, she walked away, leaving him standing there, his world tilting beneath him. And for the first time in years, Ethan realized. The past wasn't as buried as he thought. Ethan stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, his pulse hammering in his ears. Claire was gone, but the taste of her lingered on his lips, a cruel reminder of what they once had. A mistake, she had called it. But if it was a mistake, why did it feel so damn real? Why did it feel like something he had been aching for, something he had been denying himself for far too long? His fingers curled into fists as he forced himself to push the thoughts away. This wasn't about the past. This was about the present, the secrets she was keeping, the truth she refused to share. And he would find out what it was. The private investigator had been working tirelessly, but the information he provided so far only deepened the mystery. Claire's life after their divorce had been unremarkable, almost suspiciously so. She had moved to a modest neighborhood, worked multiple jobs, and kept to herself. There were no relationships, no scandals, nothing that suggested she had moved on. But there was something just beneath the surface. And Ethan was determined to uncover it. The next morning, he was reviewing documents in his office when his assistant buzzed in. Sir, I have a report from the investigator. Should I send it in? Ethan straightened in his chair, his pulse quickening. Yes, bring it now. Moments later, a folder landed on his desk. He flipped it open, scanning the neatly typed pages. There were details of Claire's work history, her financial struggles, and her tight-lipped personal life. But one name stood out. Lucas. A child's name. Ethan frowned, flipping through the pages, searching for more details. There was no last name listed. No birth records. Nothing definitive. Just a few mentions of Claire visiting a pediatrician, a daycare center, and purchasing children's items. A child. His stomach twisted. Claire had a child. And suddenly, everything started clicking into place. The late-night calls, the way she always seemed distracted, the way she guarded her private life so fiercely. Ethan's grip tightened around the papers. Was it possible? Could the child be his? A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. His assistant peeked in. Sir. Claire left suddenly again. No explanation. Ethan shot up from his chair, grabbing his coat. Where did she go? I think she left in a hurry, sir. Looked panicked. That was all he needed to hear. Ethan strode out of the office, his mind racing. He needed to see it for himself. He needed proof. Claire's heart pounded as she pushed open the doors to the daycare, her breath coming in short gasps. Where is he? She asked frantically, rushing past the front desk. The daycare worker, recognizing her panic, quickly guided her to a small room where Lucas lay curled up on a cot, his tiny face flushed with fever. Oh, baby, Claire whispered, kneeling beside him. She placed a gentle hand on his forehead, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. Mommy's here. Lucas stirred, his eyelashes fluttering open. Mommy. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. Claire forced a smile, brushing his damp curls away from his forehead. I'm here, sweetheart. We're going home. Okay. She lifted him into her arms, cradling him against her chest. The daycare staff offered to call a doctor, but Claire shook her head. She just needed to get him home, get him comfortable. As she turned to leave, a cold shiver ran down her spine. Someone was watching her. Slowly, she turned, and her blood ran cold. Ethan stood near the entrance, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes locked onto Lucas. Her breath hitched. No, not like this. She tightened her grip on Lucas, stepping back instinctively. What are you doing here? Ethan's jaw clenched. I could ask you the same thing. His gaze flickered to the child in her arms. Who is he, Claire? Her stomach twisted. It's none of your business. Ethan took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. None of my business? His voice was dangerously quiet, but she could hear the storm brewing beneath it. Don't lie to me. Claire's grip on Lucas tightened. Ethan, please. Say it. His voice was like ice, his hands clenched at his sides. Say the words, Claire. Her throat closed. She couldn't. Not like this. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his chest rising and falling with barely contained anger. Is he mine? Silence. His patience snapped. Damn it, Claire, is he mine? A tear slipped down her cheek. Yes. The word shattered the air between them. Ethan stumbled back, as if she had struck him. His face went pale, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, how could you keep this from me? His voice was raw, filled with something she had never heard before. Pain. Claire swallowed hard, her vision blurred with tears. It's not what you think. Not what I think. His voice rose. You kept my son from me. For 4 years, Claire. For damn years. Lucas stirred against her, letting out a soft whimper. Claire instantly rocked him, whispering soothing words. Ethan's eyes darkened as he watched her. How long were you planning to hide him from me? Claire's lips trembled. I wasn't trying to. Ethan let out a harsh laugh, filled with disbelief. Don't lie to me. You made a choice. A choice to erase me from his life. His hands curled into fists. Why? Did you hate me that much? Claire's breath hitched. No. Then why? His voice cracked, his control slipping. Tell me why, Claire. Her heart pounded. How could she explain? How could she make him understand? Tears burned her eyes. Because you walked away, Ethan. You left me. You left us. Ethan's face twisted in agony. Because I thought you betrayed me, and you never told me the truth. Claire's vision blurred. And would you have believed me if I did? Silence. His jaw clenched, his entire body rigid. I deserve to know. Claire wiped at her tears. I know. Her voice cracked. But I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. The anger in his eyes didn't fade, but something else flickered beneath it. Hurt. His gaze shifted back to Lucas, still curled against her, his tiny hand gripping her dress. His son. His son. Ethan's throat tightened. For 4 years, he had a son, and he never knew. A hollow ache settled deep in his chest. I want to see him, he said quietly, his voice thick. I want to know him. Claire hesitated, searching his face. Ethan, I won't walk away from him, he said firmly. His eyes burned into hers. And I won't let you keep him from me again. Her heart clenched. She had always feared this moment. Always feared what would happen if Ethan found out. But now, as she looked into his tortured eyes, she realized something. The past was no longer just between them. It was about Lucas now, and she couldn't run from the truth anymore. Ethan stood in the cold night air, his chest heaving, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. The revelation had shattered him in ways he didn't think possible. For years of silence, for years of being robbed of something he never even knew he had. A son, his head pounded, a storm raging inside him as he replayed Claire's tearful confession over and over. He had asked her no, begged her for the truth. And when she had finally spoken it, it had felt like a knife straight through his chest. Rage boiled in his veins, drowning out every other emotion. He had been deceived, lied to, betrayed in the cruelest way imaginable. His son had grown up without him, had taken his first steps, spoken his first words, all without Ethan ever knowing he existed. And Claire, she had let it happen. She had stolen that from him. The weight of it was unbearable. He stormed back to his penthouse, the city lights a blur as he moved through the streets like a man possessed. The moment he stepped inside, he grabbed a bottle of whiskey, poured himself a glass, then hurled it against the wall before he could take a single sip. The glass shattered, the sharp sound echoing through the empty space. But it wasn't enough. Nothing could dull the fury roaring inside him. Claire's voice haunted him. I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. Lies. Cowardice. She had stolen his son's childhood from him, and no excuse in the world could make that right. A bitter laugh escaped his lips as he ran a trembling hand through his hair. He had spent years believing she was the one who had been wronged, that he had been the villain for walking away. But this was unforgivable. His phone rang, cutting through the thick silence. Sir, do you want us to proceed? His lawyer's voice was crisp, emotionless. We can file immediately. Ethan didn't hesitate. Do it. A pause. Are you sure? A full custody battle. I said do it. His voice was ice, his resolve unshakable. I want her out of his life. Permanently. The call ended, leaving him alone with his fury. He had lost 4 years, but he would not lose his son. Claire would pay for what she had done. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the crumpled legal notice in her trembling hands. The words blurred before her eyes, but she didn't need to read them again. She already knew what they said. Full custody. Ethan wasn't just angry. He wanted to take Lucas away from her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as panic took hold, wrapping around her chest like a vice. This couldn't be happening. Not after everything she had endured. Not after all the sacrifices she had made to protect her son. Lucas. The thought of losing him sent a sharp, searing pain through her heart. He was her entire world, the reason she had fought so hard, suffered so much. She had done everything in her power to give him a life filled with love, even when the world had given her nothing in return. And now, Ethan was trying to take that from her. A knock on her bedroom door snapped her out of her thoughts. Mommy. Lucas's small voice was thick with sleep. Claire wiped at her eyes quickly before turning toward him, forcing a smile. Hey, sweetheart. Did I wake you? He shook his head, his stuffed bunny clutched tightly in his tiny hands. You were crying? Claire's throat tightened. Lucas was too perceptive for his own good. He always noticed when she was sad, even when she tried to hide it. She held out her arms, and he crawled onto the bed beside her, snuggling into her warmth. She pressed a kiss to his soft curls, breathing in the familiar scent of baby shampoo. "No more crying," he murmured sleepily. "I don't like it when you're sad." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. The next morning, she sat in the small office of her attorney, her hands gripping her lap so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across from her, Mr. Holloway, a seasoned but kind-eyed lawyer, adjusted his glasses and sighed. This is going to be a tough fight, Claire. She knew that. Ethan Blackwood had power, money, and the best legal team at his disposal. But she wasn't about to give up. "I need to stop this," she said, her voice hoarse. "I need to keep my son." Holloway nodded. "The courts will consider the child's best interest first. Lucas has been with you his whole life. That counts for a lot. But Ethan, he has the resources to challenge everything." Claire's stomach churned. "What do I do?" Holloway leaned forward. "We need to prove that removing Lucas from your care would be harmful to him, that you've been a loving, stable parent, and that disrupting his life would not be in his best interest." Claire nodded. "Because it wouldn't be." Holloway's gaze softened. "Then we fight." The legal battle turned into a nightmare. The moment the media caught wind of the lawsuit, the story exploded. Billionaire mogul Ethan Blackwood in custody battle over secret son. The headline screamed betrayal, scandal, drama. Paparazzi swarmed Claire's apartment, flashing cameras at her as she carried Lucas to daycare. Strangers whispered behind her back at the grocery store. Online articles painted her as the villain, a woman who had stolen a child from his father. Ethan, however, remained untouchable. His lawyers tore through her life with brutal precision, dissecting every decision she had ever made. Why hadn't she come forward sooner? Why had she kept Ethan in the dark? Was she financially stable enough to provide for a child without Blackwood's fortune? Claire sat in the courtroom, numb as Ethan's lead attorney painted her as an unfit mother. She hid the existence of Mr. Blackwood's son for over 4 years, the lawyer said, voice dripping with disdain. A deliberate and cruel deception. Can we trust a woman who has already proven she will lie to keep a father from his child? Claire flinched, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. But nothing stung more than when Ethan himself took the stand. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared herself for it. But nothing could have steeled her against the cold, detached way he spoke. "She took away my right to be a father," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes burning with barely contained rage. "She made a choice that was never hers to make. And now, I'm making mine. I want my son." Claire's heart clenched painfully. Lucas wasn't a prize to be won. He was a child. Her child. When it was her turn to speak, she felt the weight of every gaze in the courtroom pressing down on her. Ethan sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "I never wanted to keep Lucas from his father," she began, her voice wavering. I tried to tell Ethan, but he..." Her throat closed, the painful memories crashing into her. "He wouldn't listen." The courtroom fell into silence. The judge's gaze sharpened. "Explain, Miss Lawson." Claire took a shaky breath. This was it. The moment the truth had to come out. Tears pricked her eyes as she recalled the night Ethan had thrown her out of his life. The night she had stood in the rain, holding on to the last shred of hope that he would believe her. "I found out I was pregnant right after our divorce," she said. "I tried to reach him. I left messages, wrote letters. I even went to his office, but I was turned away every time." Her voice broke. He had already decided I was a liar, that I had betrayed him, and nothing I said would change that. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. "I had no choice," Claire whispered. "I had to protect my child. So I left. I raised him alone, not because I wanted to keep him from his father, but because his father had shut the door on us before I ever had a chance to explain." The silence in the room was suffocating. Claire forced herself to meet Ethan's gaze. For the first time since their battle had begun, she saw something other than fury in his eyes. She saw doubt, regret, pain. For the first time, she saw the realization sink in. She had never abandoned him. He had abandoned her. Ethan looked away, his expression unreadable. The judge exhaled slowly. We will reconvene in 2 weeks with final testimonies before reaching a decision. As the courtroom emptied, Claire remained seated, her heart pounding. She had spoken her truth. But was it enough to keep her son? Was it enough to change Ethan's mind? Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, the city skyline stretching endlessly beyond the massive glass windows. The weight of Claire's words clung to him like a suffocating fog, refusing to let go. He gripped the glass of whiskey in his hand, but the burn did nothing to dull the ache in his chest. I tried to reach him. I left messages, wrote letters. I even went to his office, but I was turned away every time. Her voice echoed in his head, slicing through him with brutal precision. He had spent years hating her, believing she had deliberately stolen his child from him. But now, a far more painful truth stared him in the face. She had tried, and he had shut her out. His hands trembled as he set the glass down. His mind drifted back to the past, to the days after their marriage had crumbled. He had been drowning in anger, convinced Claire had betrayed him. He had refused to see her, refused to read the letters she sent. He had believed it was his way of protecting himself. But in doing so, he had destroyed something far more precious. He had abandoned her. And worse, he had abandoned his son. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His lawyer, Richard Graves, stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "We need to discuss the next steps," Graves said, placing a thick folder on the desk. "The court will reconvene in 2 weeks. If we keep pushing, I'm confident we can win full custody." Ethan stared at the folder, but didn't touch it. "Full custody," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Yes. Given Claire's actions, the judge will see that she deliberately withheld your son from you. We can use that to prove she isn't fit to make decisions for him." Ethan remained silent. Graves adjusted his tie. "Ethan, you've wanted this from the beginning. If we press hard enough, Lucas will be yours." Ethan clenched his jaw. Lucas, the little boy with Claire's eyes and his stubborn frown. The child who had climbed into his lap without hesitation, as if he had known, somehow, that Ethan was meant to protect him. And Claire, the woman who had endured years of struggle alone, raising their son while he had lived his life in ignorance. The anger that had once fueled him had faded into something heavier, something suffocating. Regret. Shame. "Drop the case," Ethan said suddenly. Graves blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said drop it." His lawyer frowned. "Ethan, this is an emotional reaction. You'll regret it. If we don't fight for custody, Claire will keep Lucas from you." "She never tried to keep him from me." Ethan cut in, his voice low. "I did that to myself." Graves sighed. "Look, I understand that this is a lot to take in, but you have to think rationally. If you let this go, you might lose your chance to be in your son's life." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Taking him from Claire would be the worst thing I could do. He loves her. He needs her." The words tasted foreign, but they were the truth. For weeks, he had been blinded by fury, obsessed with the idea of making Claire pay for what he thought she had done. But he saw it now. Lucas was never a prize to be won. He was a child who needed his mother, a child who needed both of them. Graves exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "So what? You just walk away?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "I don't walk away. I make things right." 2 days later, Claire sat at the kitchen table, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. She had barely slept since the last court hearing, constantly haunted by the possibility of losing Lucas. The sound of the doorbell sent a jolt through her. Frowning, she stood and made her way to the door. The moment she pulled it open, her breath caught. Ethan. He stood on her doorstep, looking different than she had ever seen him. The sharp arrogance was gone. The fury that had once burned in his eyes had dimmed, replaced with something far more unsettling. "Regret. Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Claire swallowed, her heart pounding. "Ethan, if this is about the case." "I'm dropping it," he said. The words took a moment to register. Claire stared at him, stunned. "What?" "I'm not fighting for full custody anymore." He exhaled slowly. "I was wrong, Claire. About everything." Her fingers tightened on the doorknob. She wanted to believe him, but she had spent too long bracing for war. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's gaze dropped. "Because I finally listened." He swallowed hard. "You tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. I should have. And now, I don't want to make the same mistake again." Claire felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she held them back. "So, what happens now?" Ethan hesitated. "I want to be in Lucas's life, but not like this. Not as someone who tears him away from the only home he's ever known." He met her gaze. "I want us to figure it out together." Claire's breath shuddered out of her. For so long, she had imagined this moment, a time when Ethan would understand, when he would stop seeing her as an enemy. But reality was always more complicated. "You can't just expect everything to be okay," she said quietly. "You can't undo years of pain with a single conversation." Ethan nodded. "I know." He hesitated, his voice dropping. "But I want to try." Claire stared at him for a long moment. There was still so much hurt between them, so much history that couldn't be erased. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't demanding or accusing. He wasn't trying to punish her. He was trying to fix what was broken. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." Ethan kept showing up, not just for Lucas, but for Claire too. He never overstepped, never forced his way in. He simply became part of their routine. He picked Lucas up from preschool, helped with bedtime stories, stayed for dinner when Claire let him. The shifts were small, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. One night, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Claire stood at the sink washing dishes. Ethan lingered in the doorway. "Let me help," he offered. She glanced at him before sighing and handing him a dish towel. They worked in silence, the tension that once defined them slowly being replaced by something gentler. Then, Claire broke the quiet. "He talks about you all the time now." Ethan smiled softly. "Yeah." She nodded. "He told me yesterday that you make the best dinosaur noises." Ethan chuckled. "Well, that's high praise." Claire smirked, then her expression sobered. "He loves you, Ethan." Something in his chest ached at the truth of it. "I love him too." Claire turned off the faucet, drying her hands. "I see that now." Ethan set the dish towel down, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. "I know I can't erase the past," he said carefully, "but I want to build something better. For him. And maybe," he hesitated, "maybe for us too." Claire tensed. "Ethan, I'm not asking for anything," he interrupted gently. "I just want you to know that what I feel hasn't changed." Her breath hitched, but she looked away. "It's not that simple." "I know," he admitted, "but nothing about us ever was." Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know if I can trust you again." Ethan's heart clenched, but he nodded. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you can." Days passed, then weeks, and slowly, Claire found herself letting him in. She caught herself watching him when he read to Lucas, when he carried their sleepy son to bed, when he laughed at Lucas's silly jokes. And one evening, she caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, Lucas curled up against his chest. The sight of them, father and son, completely at peace, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent years convincing herself that Ethan was nothing but a painful memory. But here he was changing, growing, proving with every moment that maybe, just maybe, he was worth a risk. Claire took a deep breath. Maybe it was time to let go of the past. Maybe it was time to hope again. One night, as Ethan was about to leave, Claire stopped him at the door. "Stay," she whispered. Ethan froze, his eyes searching hers. "Claire," she swallowed hard. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I know that when you're here, things feel right." Ethan's breath caught. "Are you sure?" She exhaled slowly. No, a small, wry smile tugged at her lips. "But I'm willing to try." Ethan reached for her hand, hesitating just for a second. When she didn't pull away, he laced his fingers with hers. "Then we'll take it one step at a time," he promised. Claire nodded, something fragile but hopeful in her eyes. One step at a time. Together. Ethan didn't expect everything to change overnight. Claire was still cautious, still guarded. She had spent years building walls to protect herself, and he knew that trust wouldn't return in an instant. But she had let him in, just a little, and that was enough to make him hold on. The days passed, each one bringing a new piece of their broken past into the light. Ethan and Claire worked together, adjusting to the delicate balance of co-parenting. They made small compromises, switching weekends, planning outings together for Lucas's sake. The tension that once filled their conversations had softened, replaced by something gentler, something closer to the way things used to be. And yet, Ethan wanted more. He knew he loved Claire. He always had. But love wasn't enough. It never had been. He had to prove to her, not just with words but with actions, that he had changed. So, he kept showing up, not just for Lucas, but for her. One evening, Ethan found himself standing in Claire's kitchen, stirring a pot of soup while Lucas sat at the table, coloring. Claire leaned against the counter, watching him with an amused expression. "I never pictured you cooking," she said. Ethan smirked. "I had to learn. Turns out billion-dollar deals don't teach you how to make a decent meal." Claire shook her head, but there was warmth in her eyes. "You're full of surprises these days." He looked at her then, holding her gaze. "I'm just trying to be the man you and Lucas deserve." Something flickered in her expression, something hesitant, something hopeful. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she simply turned back to setting the table. It wasn't much, but it was a step. One weekend, Ethan took Lucas on a surprise trip to the aquarium. The little boy's eyes lit up as they walked through the enormous glass tunnels, surrounded by shimmering fish and slow-moving turtles. Ethan couldn't stop watching him. Every reaction, every giggle, every moment of awe. At one point, Lucas slipped his tiny hand into Ethan's, looking up at him with a beaming smile. "This is the best day ever," he exclaimed. Ethan's heart clenched. He squeezed Lucas's hand gently. "Yeah, buddy, it really is." Later that evening, when he brought Lucas home, Claire was waiting by the door. Lucas immediately launched into an excited retelling of everything he had seen. "Mommy, we saw a shark, and a sea lion, and Daddy let me touch a starfish." Ethan stilled. It was the first time Lucas had called him that. Claire must have noticed too, because her breath hitched. She looked up at Ethan, something unreadable in her eyes. Lucas continued talking, oblivious to the moment between them. But Ethan saw it. The way Claire's fingers trembled slightly, the way her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Finally, she exhaled. "Thank you," she murmured. Ethan smiled softly. "Anytime." And he meant it. As the weeks passed, Claire found herself noticing things about Ethan that she hadn't let herself see before. How patient he was with Lucas. How gentle. How he always made sure to say goodnight, even if it was just over the phone. How he never once pushed her for more than she was ready to give. One night, after Lucas had gone to bed, she found Ethan sitting on the porch, staring at the night sky. She hesitated before stepping outside and sitting next to him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Claire broke the silence. "I used to dream about this," she admitted. Ethan turned his head slightly. "About what?" She swallowed. "Us. Together. Raising Lucas." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Claire." "I know," she cut in. "Things happened. We can't change the past." She let out a slow breath. "But I see you, Ethan. I see how much you love him. And I see how hard you're trying." Ethan's heart pounded. "Does that mean?" She looked at him then, and for the first time in years, there was no anger in her gaze. Just uncertainty. Just hope. "I don't know what it means," she admitted. "But maybe I'm ready to find out." Ethan reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Then we'll take it slow as you need." Claire squeezed his hand, a small, tentative smile appearing. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The real turning point came on a quiet Sunday morning. Lucas had insisted on making pancakes, which resulted in a messy but endearing disaster in the kitchen. Claire and Ethan worked together to clean up, laughing at Lucas's attempts to help by spreading flour everywhere. When they finally sat down to eat, Lucas grinned at them both. "This is the best breakfast ever," he declared. Claire chuckled. Even though most of it ended up on the floor, Lucas nodded enthusiastically. Then, he tilted his head. "Are you and Daddy friends now?" Ethan and Claire exchanged glances. The question caught them off guard, but it was a fair one. Ethan smiled gently. "We're trying, buddy." Lucas beamed. "Good. I like it when we're all together." Claire exhaled slowly. Then, without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over Ethan's. His eyes met hers, searching, questioning. And in that moment, Claire finally knew. It wasn't just about Lucas. It wasn't just about the past. It was about them. About the love that had never truly disappeared. Maybe it had been broken. Maybe it had been buried under pain and betrayal. But it had survived. And now, they had a second chance. Claire squeezed his hand, smiling softly. "Me too," she whispered. Ethan's breath caught, but he didn't let go. Neither did she. Months passed, and slowly, the fractures between them healed. It wasn't perfect. They had arguments. They had doubts. But they had something even more important, each other. One evening, as the sun set over the backyard, Ethan stood beside Claire, watching Lucas chase fireflies. He glanced at her, heart pounding. "Claire." She looked up at him, curiosity in her gaze. "Yeah." Ethan exhaled. "I love you." Claire stilled. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she smiled. "I know." Ethan let out a soft chuckle. "And—" She turned toward him, eyes shining. "And I love you too." Ethan's breath hitched. Before he could think, before he could second-guess, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was home. When they finally pulled apart, Claire leaned her forehead against his. "We really made a mess of things, didn't we?" Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, but we figured it out." Claire glanced at Lucas, who was now spinning in circles, laughing to himself. "We did." Ethan squeezed her hand. "So what do you say we make it official?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Ethan smirked. "Move in with me." Claire's eyes widened. "Ethan, not for me," he interrupted. "For us. For Lucas." He paused. "But mostly for you, because I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Ever." Claire swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" He cupped her face, his gaze steady. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." A tear slipped down her cheek. Then, finally she nodded. "Yes." Ethan exhaled, grinning. "Yeah." Claire laughed softly. "Yeah." And just like that, they weren't just two people trying to fix a broken past. They were a family. Finally, completely a family.